In Hollywood, divorcing a mafia hitman doesn't make you a hero. It destroys your life. When movie star June Lang ran from her ruthless mob enforcer husband, she expected the studios to protect her. Instead, they protected the monster. The executives blacklisted the innocent wife into absolute poverty to maintain their pristine image, while ironically handing the convicted gangster a producer's chair. This isn't a movie script. It's the most sickening betrayal in cinematic history. This is the story of June Lang and Johnny Roselli. Why did the Factory of Dreams punish the victim while crowning the villain? The answer lies in the exact nature of the predator the studios chose to protect. They didn't align themselves with a common street criminal. They aligned themselves with a man who mirrored their own corporate ruthlessness and understood the absolute value of a flawless public image. Johnny Roselli did not look like a mobster. He did not carry a baseball bat or shout threats in crowded restaurants. Known as the Henry Kissinger of the Mafia, he wore bespoke London suits and dined at the Brown Derby. Born Filippo Sacco in Italy in 1905, he learned the trade of organized crime under Al Capone in Chicago. After changing his name to John Roselli to evade a murder investigation, he realized that shooting people drew too much attention. True power was invisible. True power wore a tuxedo. In the 1930s, the Chicago outfit sent him to Los Angeles with a specific mission: bleed the booming film industry dry. Instead of street violence, Roselli used bureaucratic leverage. He helped the mob take control of the Stagehands Union, the international alliance of theatrical stage employees. The strategy was a brutal extortion scheme disguised as labor negotiations. Pay the mob, or the projectors go dark nationwide. Studio executives like Harry Cohn at Columbia and Louis B. Mayer at MGM were not victims. They were willing participants. They happily handed Roselli briefcases of cash to ensure labor peace and keep the working class in line. But with J. Edgar Hoover's FBI watching, the mobster needed a legitimate disguise. He needed a permanent shield into Los Angeles high society. A pass that couldn't be revoked by a police background check. He found that shield in Winifred June Vlasek, known to the world as movie star June Lang. Born in 1917, June was everything Roselli was not. She was a devout Catholic with a pristine reputation. Pushed by a relentless stage mother, she had survived the grueling chorus lines to secure major speaking roles at 20th Century Fox. Naive to the city's dark underbelly, she existed in a protected bubble manufactured by the studios. Roselli targeted her with calculated precision. He didn't approach her in a dark alley, but under the bright lights of a Hollywood nightclub, introducing himself as a wealthy, independent film producer. While her inner world was filled with scripts and costume fittings, his was a ledger of extortion payments and the constant threat of a federal indictment. June saw only a respected businessman who could protect her from the predatory men in casting offices. She did not see the blood on his money. When he proposed, she accepted unknowingly, stepping into a meticulously crafted psychological trap. They married on April 1st, 1940. The ceremony was heavily covered by the press, with photographs showing a radiant bride and a confident groom. As Roselli smiled for the cameras, he had achieved his ultimate objective. He had purchased a flawless reputation. He used her spotless image to wash his own dirty money. He attended high society galas with her on his arm. He dared the police and the press to question his legitimacy. "Look at my wife," his presence implied. "Would a wholesome starlet marry a gangster?" To the public, he was Mr. June Lang. Behind closed doors, He was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar shakedown of 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, and Paramount. The marriage was a transactional nightmare, but June did not know it. She returned to work. She focused on her acting. She landed a prominent role in the hit musical Footlight Serenade. She danced on screen. She smiled. She was on the verge of becoming a household name. She believed she had achieved the Hollywood dream. She had a successful career and a loving, powerful husband. Roselli went to work every day, treating the dimly lit back booth of a restaurant as his executive office, where his primary associates were men with broken noses carrying thick envelopes. He efficiently collected extortion payments from the studios, sending the bulk of the cash back to Chicago while keeping a generous cut to fund his own lavish lifestyle. Operating as a shadow executive, he actively managed the local politicians and paid off the local police, ensuring the corrupt machine ran smoothly without drawing unwanted attention. He kept his two lives strictly separated. He never brought his associates to the house. He never discussed his business over dinner. While some historians debate the true extent of her awareness, official records suggest June lived in a state of carefully engineered ignorance. When she asked about his film projects, he provided vague answers about financing and distribution delays, which she accepted. She had no reason not to, especially when the studio executives themselves treated him with absolute deference. If the head of a major movie studio treated Johnny Roselli like a legitimate businessman, why would his wife suspect otherwise? But the foundation of their life was built on a fault line. The Chicago outfit was greedy. They pushed the extortion scheme too far. They demanded too much money from the studios. They became sloppy. The federal government had been building a case. The FBI had informants inside the union. They had financial records. They had wiretaps. They were mapping the flow of cash from the studio vaults in Los Angeles to the mob bosses in Chicago. They were preparing to strike. June Lang continued to read her scripts. She memorized her lines. She worried about camera angles and lighting. She lay in bed next to a man who was facing decades in federal prison. The silence in their house was not peaceful. It was a countdown. The flashbulbs from their wedding were about to be replaced by the harsh glare of federal interrogation lamps. The factory of dreams was about to reveal its true nature, and June Lang was standing directly in the blast radius. The morning sun cut through the Los Angeles smog. June Lang sat in a velvet chair in the makeup department of 20th Century Fox. A team of women hovered around her. They powdered her nose. They curled her hair. They painted her lips a specific shade of red dictated by the studio executives. She stared at her reflection in the mirror surrounded by harsh, incandescent bulbs. Her inner thoughts were consumed by the script resting on her lap. She worried about her marks. She worried about her lighting. She worried about maintaining the innocent, cheerful persona that paid her salary. She was a product on an assembly line. She accepted this reality. It was the only way to survive in the business. Miles away, her husband was conducting a very different type of business. Johnny Roselli sat in a leather booth at a dimly lit restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. He did not wear makeup. He wore a tailored suit paid for by the sweat of union projectionists. Across the table sat a studio executive. The executive looked nervous. He sweated through his expensive shirt. Roselli did not sweat. He sipped his black coffee. He slid a thick, unmarked envelope across the table. The executive took it. The envelope contained thousands of dollars in untraceable cash. It was the price of doing business. It was the tax levied by the Chicago outfit to ensure the cameras kept rolling. Roselli operated with chilling efficiency. He worked closely with two men named Willie Beoff and George Brown. Beoff was a former pimp. Brown was a corrupt union official. Together, they controlled the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. They had the power to shut down every movie theater in the United States with a single phone call. The studio bosses were terrified of this power. Men like Nicholas Schenck, the president of Lowe's Incorporated, and Harry Cohn, the tyrannical head of Columbia Pictures, capitulated. They handed over millions of dollars to Beoff and Brown. Roselli was the local muscle. He was the enforcer who ensured the payments were delivered on time. He was the smooth operator who smoothed over the rough edges of the extortion racket. Blissfully unaware, June finished her makeup and walked onto the soundstage. She flawlessly hit her marks, smiling and dancing for the cameras before joining her co-stars for lunch. They chatted about fashion and gossip, living in a hermetically sealed bubble of privilege and artificial light. Finishing his coffee, Roselli collected the envelopes and drove to a secure location to count and bundle the cash for Chicago. Because Frank Nitti, the boss of the Chicago outfit, demanded his cut, Roselli always delivered. As a loyal soldier who deeply understood the hierarchy of violence and the grim fate of men who skimmed off the top, he kept his hands completely clean. Letting Beoff and Brown take the dangerous spotlight, he vastly preferred operating in the shadows. The duality of their marriage was a masterpiece of deception. Returning home every evening, Roselli would kiss his wife, ask about her day, and listen patiently as she complained about a difficult director or a scratchy costume. Offering sympathetic words, he played the role of the supportive husband flawlessly, never raising his voice and never bringing his associates to their Beverly Hills home, effectively keeping the violence locked away in the trunk of his car. Wanting desperately to believe the lie because the truth was too dangerous to contemplate, June rationalized his small inconsistencies. When faced with late-night phone calls in coded phrases or sudden trips to Chicago, supposedly for film financing, she convinced herself that the production business was inherently opaque, blindly trusting the man who shared her bed. She also trusted the studio executives. She attended lavish parties in Bel Air and Beverly Hills. She walked into ballrooms holding Roselli by the arm. She saw the most powerful men in Hollywood. She saw Louis B. Mayer. She saw Jack Warner. These men smiled at her. They kissed her cheek. They shook Roselli by the hand. They offered him drinks. They treated him like an equal. This was the most insidious part of the deception. The studio bosses knew exactly who Roselli was. They knew he was a gangster. They knew he was extorting their companies. They knew he was funneling money to the Chicago mob. Yet, they welcomed him into their homes. They drank his liquor. They protected his secret. They looked at June Lang, a young actress on their payroll, and they said nothing. They allowed her to remain married to a predator because it served their interests. They needed Roselli to keep the unions in check. They viewed June Lang as acceptable collateral damage. The hypocrisy was staggering. The studios enforced strict moral clauses in their contracts. An actress could be fired for getting a divorce. An actress could be blacklisted for an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. The studios demanded absolute purity from their stars. They sold morality to the American public. But behind closed doors, they colluded with organized crime. They funded a syndicate built on murder, gambling, and prostitution. They traded briefcases full of cash while lecturing the public on family values. June moved through this world blindfolded. She was a prop. Roselli used her to normalize his presence in Los Angeles. A mobster walking alone into a Hollywood party draws suspicion. A mobster walking into a Hollywood party with a beautiful famous actress draws admiration. She was his human shield, but the shield was starting to crack. The Chicago outfit was not satisfied. Greed is the fatal flaw of every criminal enterprise. Bioff and Brown grew arrogant. They demanded more money. They squeezed the studios harder. They flaunted their wealth. Bioff bought a massive estate in the San Fernando Valley. He threw lavish parties. He drew attention to himself. Attention is toxic to organized crime. The Internal Revenue Service began to notice the sudden influx of cash. The Federal Bureau of Investigation started asking questions. Agents began to trace the money. They audited the studio books. They found discrepancies. They found massive, unexplained payouts disguised as legal fees and consulting expenses. The paper trail led directly to Bioff and Brown. The investigation gathered momentum. The federal prosecutors smelled blood. They issued subpoenas. They squeezed the studio executives. The executives panicked. They were facing federal prison for tax evasion and conspiracy. They had to make a choice. They could protect the mob or they could protect themselves. They chose themselves. Men like Harry Cohn and Nicholas Schenck agreed to testify. They turned state's evidence. They admitted they had paid millions of dollars to the mob. They claimed they were victims of extortion. They claimed they had paid the money to prevent strikes and save their businesses. They painted themselves as helpless hostages. It was a convenient lie. They had benefited immensely from the corrupt union leadership. They had kept wages low and profits high. But the federal government needed witnesses. The government granted them immunity in exchange for their testimony against the mobsters. The net closed around Willie Bioff and George Brown. They were indicted. They were arrested. The news hit the front pages of the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. The biggest extortion scandal in Hollywood history was exposed to the daylight. Roselli read the newspapers. He knew the end was near. He knew Bioff was weak. He knew Bioff would talk to save his own skin. Roselli remained calm. He did not run. Running was an admission of guilt. He stayed in Los Angeles. He continued to play the role of the legitimate producer. He continued to sleep next to his wife. June read the same newspapers. She saw the headlines. She saw the names of the men her husband did business with. She saw the word extortion. She saw the word mafia. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. Her brain struggled to process the information. The man she loved was connected to a national crime syndicate. The business trips to Chicago were not for film financing. The late-night phone calls were not about casting decisions. The illusion shattered completely in 1943 when the federal government handed down a massive indictment. The grand jury targeted the top leadership of the Chicago outfit, indicting Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, and ultimately Johnny Roselli. When the FBI finally arrived at the Beverly Hills estate, they cared nothing for June Lang's shooting schedule or her carefully crafted wholesome image. Bypassing the Hollywood illusion entirely, agents placed Johnny Roselli under arrest and marched him away in handcuffs. June stood in the foyer. She watched the federal agents search her home. She watched them tear through her husband's desk. The reality of her situation crushed her. She was married to a mobster. Her career, her reputation, her entire life was contaminated. Faced with a life-altering choice, she could have easily played the loyal mob wife, visiting her husband in prison, accepting the blood money, and living in comfortable denial like so many others. June Lang vehemently refused. As a working actress from Minnesota who had built her career on discipline and grueling hours under hot lights, she absolutely refused to let a criminal drag her down into the gutter. The anger replaced the shock. She realized she had been used. She realized her marriage was a tactical maneuver engineered by the Chicago outfit. She had been violated. Her trust had been weaponized against her. She felt a profound sense of disgust. She did not hesitate. She called her lawyer. She instructed him to file for divorce immediately. She cited extreme cruelty. She wanted the legal separation finalized as quickly as the courts would allow. She wanted to surgically remove Johnny Roselli from her life. She thought this was the correct course of action. She thought the truth was a defense. She believed in the inherent justice of the system. She thought the studio executives would understand. They knew she was innocent. They knew she had been duped. She assumed they would offer her sympathy. She assumed they would protect one of their own stars. She assumed her career would continue once she cleared her name and distanced herself from the mob. She was completely, fatally wrong. She misunderstood the nature of the beast. The studio system did not care about justice. The studio system cared about optics. The studio system cared about self-preservation. The brutal truth was, the studio system had already begun turning its back on her the moment she married him. Powerful executives like Daryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox had warned her about Roselli's underworld ties. When she ignored them, choosing to believe her husband, the studio coldly invoked the morals clause to terminate her contract. Claiming her association with a gangster brought disgrace to their wholesome image. By the time the massive 1943 indictment hit, and Willie Beoff began naming names in federal court, the executives were terrified. The men who ran Hollywood were fighting for their lives and their fortunes, desperate to hide their own complicity in the extortion racket. June believed her public divorce would serve as a declaration of innocence, forcing the industry to welcome her back with open arms. Instead, her brave stand backfired completely. The major studios didn't see an innocent woman clearing her name. They saw a walking, talking reminder of the exact mob connections they were trying to bury. They could not punish Johnny Roselli, who was facing federal prison, and they certainly could not punish the Chicago outfit. But they could punish June Lang. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same men firing her for being associated with Johnny Roselli had personally handed Johnny Roselli hundreds of thousands of dollars. They had drank his whiskey, they had shaken his hand. But the executives possessed the power to rewrite the narrative. They controlled the press. They controlled the casting directors. June's agent tried to find her work at other studios. He called Warner Brothers. He called Paramount. He called MGM. The doors were slammed shut. The phones went dead. The word was out. June Lang was poisoned. She was blacklisted. Although she was 30 years old, at the absolute peak of her beauty and finally ready for major leading roles, her career evaporated overnight. Scripts stopped coming, Bel Air party invitations vanished, and industry friends abruptly severed contact, terrified that the mob contagion would spread to them and anger the vindictive studio bosses. June was left completely alone. The divorce proceeded. She shed the name Roselli, but she could not shed the stigma. She had done the right thing. She had stood up to a criminal. She had refused to be complicit, and for her bravery, she was handed a death sentence by the industry she had dedicated her life to. She watched from the sidelines as the extortion trial reached its climax. The federal prosecutors secured convictions. Johnny Roselli was found guilty of conspiracy and extortion. The judge handed down a 10-year sentence. He was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. The Chicago outfit took a massive hit. Frank Nitti, the boss of the outfit, committed suicide rather than face prison time. The federal government declared a victory over organized crime. The studio executives breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had survived the storm, they had testified, they had played the victims, they kept their mansions, they kept their studios, they went back to making movies. June Lang sat in her modest apartment. The silence was absolute. The phone did not ring, the flashbulbs did not pop. The Hollywood machine had chewed her up and spit her out. She had been sacrificed on the altar of public relations. She was the scapegoat used to cleanse the sins of the moguls. Needing to pay rent and buy groceries, the former movie star desperately looked for work. Unable to find acting jobs, she swallowed her pride and took on menial clerical roles, answering telephones, typing invoices, and filing paperwork. Living a quiet, desperate life in the shadows of the Hollywood sign, she was forced to watch other actresses take the starring roles that were meant for her. She experienced the ultimate betrayal. The system she had trusted had destroyed her. But the final insult was yet to come, and it began the moment Johnny Roselli was sent away. The heavy iron gates of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary slammed shut behind him in 1944. To an ordinary man, a 10-year federal sentence for extortion was a death blow. It meant the end of a career, the loss of freedom, and the destruction of a future. But Johnny Roselli was not an ordinary man. He was a made member of the Chicago outfit. For a high-ranking mobster, federal prison was not a punishment. It was a temporary relocation. It was a networking opportunity. Inside the thick stone walls, the hierarchy of the underworld remained completely intact. Roselli did not sleep in a cramped, dangerous cell. He did not eat the standard prison rations. He was incarcerated alongside the top brass of the Chicago syndicate, including Paul Ricca and Louis Campagna. They effectively ran their cell block. Corrupt guards facilitated their needs. They received smuggled steaks. They drank contraband liquor. They held meetings. They continued to issue directives to their subordinates on the outside. Roselli served his time with the calm detachment of a corporate executive attending a mandatory retreat. He kept his mouth shut. He did not cooperate with the federal investigators. He proved his ultimate loyalty to the outfit. He proved he was a stand-up guy who could take the heat without breaking. Outside those walls, June Lang was serving a very different kind of sentence. Her prison had no iron bars. It was built of silence and closed doors. The blacklist was total and absolute. The studios enforced it with ruthless efficiency. Casting directors who had previously praised her talent now refused to look her in the eye if they passed her on the street. Her agent stopped returning her calls before finally dropping her from his roster. She was radioactive. The executives had successfully attached the stench of the extortion scandal to her, ensuring that her presence on a movie poster would remind the public of the industry's own corrupt compromises. June watched her bank account drain. The luxurious life in Beverly Hills evaporated. She had to move to a smaller, unassuming apartment. The glamorous gowns were pushed to the back of the closet, replaced by sensible, inexpensive clothing. She was a woman who had trained her entire life to perform under hot lights, to hit precise marks, to memorize complex dialogue. Those skills were now entirely useless. The industry demanded that she disappear, but she still had to eat. She still had to pay rent. She swallowed a profound, bitter humiliation and entered the civilian workforce. The former leading lady took a job as a switchboard operator. Sitting in a crowded, noisy room with a headset securely fastened, she spent her days operating a massive, blinking switchboard. In a cruel twist of irony, she found herself physically plugging the telephone cords that connected the exact same executives who had exiled her into poverty. As she linked their calls, She was forced to listen to producers and directors negotiating deals and making movies. She was an invisible component of the Hollywood machine moving forward without her. Relegated to typing invoices and filing paperwork, she lived a life of grinding, repetitive anonymity. Yet she bore this cruel exile with quiet dignity, refusing to sell her story to the tabloids or beg the studio executives for readmittance. She simply tried to survive the collateral damage of a brutal war she had never asked to be a part of. While June connected telephone cables, the Chicago outfit was connecting political wires. The mob bosses were not content to let their top earners rot in Atlanta. They deployed their vast financial resources to subvert the American justice system. They initiated a massive covert bribery campaign. They targeted politicians, lawyers, and officials within the federal parole board. Cash moved in thick envelopes through illicit channels. The objective was clear. They wanted Rica, Campagna, and Roselli out of prison. The fix was executed with brazen audacity. In August 1947, after serving barely 3.5 years of a 10-year sentence, Johnny Roselli walked out of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The parole board granted early release to the mobsters, citing good behavior. The decision triggered massive public outrage. Investigative journalists published scathing reports. Congressional committees would later launch investigations into the blatant corruption that facilitated the release. It was widely understood that the parole had been purchased. But public outrage means nothing to a man who operates above the law. Roselli did not care about the congressional hearings. He stepped out of the prison gates and into a waiting car. He was handed a tailored suit. He was handed a stack of cash. He was back in business. He did not go into hiding. He did not assume a new identity. He bought a first-class ticket and headed straight back to Los Angeles. Upon his return to Los Angeles, the true terrifying pragmatism of the Hollywood studio system fully revealed itself. The very same studio bosses who had just testified against the mob claiming to be helpless victims extorted out of millions did not bar the convicted gangster from their lots or call the police. Instead, they welcomed him back with open arms. Roselli walked into the Brown Derby restaurant. The maitre d' did not block his path. The maitre d' smiled, bowed, and led him to a premium booth. Studio executives sitting at nearby tables saw him. They did not avert their eyes in disgust. They stood up. They walked over. They shook his hand. They offered him a drink. They welcomed him back to the coast. It was the ultimate, sickening double standard. While the major studios that banished an innocent actress to a switchboard kept their corporate hands technically clean, the broader Hollywood machine had no such qualms. They embraced Roselli because they understood the reality of power. Brian Foy, the head of production at Eagle Lion Studios, a smaller company churning out gritty B movies, officially hired Roselli. Foy knew exactly who Roselli was. Foy did not care about the federal conviction. Foy recognized that the public had developed an insatiable appetite for gritty, realistic crime films. The genre of film noir was exploding. Audiences wanted stories about mobsters, heists, and detectives. Foy believed that Roselli could provide unparalleled authenticity to these productions. Roselli accepted the job. He was given an office on the studio lot. He walked the grounds not as an extortionist, but as a creative executive. He sat in canvas chairs on active sets. He reviewed scripts. He advised directors on how real criminals spoke, how they moved, and how they killed. He utilized his lifetime of violent experience to manufacture entertainment. He received screen credit as an associate producer. He produced the film Cannon City in 1948. It was a prison break movie. The irony of a man who had just bought his way out of federal prison, producing a film about inmates escaping a penitentiary, was completely lost on the Hollywood establishment. The film was a critical and commercial success. Roselli followed it up by producing He Walked by Night, a dark, tense police procedural. He was highly effective at his job. He understood pacing. He understood tension. He was helping to define the aesthetic of American film noir. He was making art out of his own atrocities. June Lang saw the movie posters. She walked past the theaters in Los Angeles. She saw the marquees advertising the new crime thrillers from Eagle Lion Studios. She bought a ticket with her meager earnings. She sat alone in the dark auditorium. She watched the credits roll up the silver screen. She saw the name Johnny Roselli listed in bold letters as the producer. She was watching the total victory of her abuser, facilitated by the very industry that had destroyed her. The studios had stripped her of her identity. They had taken her face off the screen. They had relegated her to the invisible working class. Yet they placed the name of the man who had dragged her into a federal scandal prominently on the celluloid. They validated him, they paid him, they celebrated him. June realized the brutal truth. Hollywood did not punish Johnny Roselli because Hollywood was exactly like Johnny Roselli. The studio bosses and the mafia operated on the exact same principles. They both valued power, leverage, and the suppression of the weak. They both viewed human beings as expendable commodities. They understood each other. They spoke the same language of ruthless self-interest. June Lang spoke the language of basic decency. And in Los Angeles, that made her a foreign enemy. She did not break. She did not turn to drugs or alcohol to numb the pain of her erasure. She maintained her dignity. She continued to work her clerical jobs. She changed her name back to June Vlasek in her private life. She tried to distance herself from the wreckage of the Lang persona. She focused on her family. She focused on surviving. She accepted that the dream was dead, murdered by a corporate syndicate that operated with absolute impunity. Johnny Roselli's ambitions expanded far beyond the studio lots. His success as a producer was merely a stepping stone. He was regaining his status within the Chicago outfit. The mob bosses were pleased with his ability to reintegrate into Los Angeles high society. They gave him new responsibilities. They put him in charge of their interests in Las Vegas. Las Vegas was transforming from a dusty desert town into the gambling capital of the world. The mob was building massive hotel casinos. They were skimming millions of dollars in untaxed cash directly from the counting rooms. Roselli became the chief liaison between the Chicago outfit and the Las Vegas casino operators. He was the man who ensured the skim flowed uninterrupted. He lived in luxury suites. He walked the casino floors. He directed the flow of illicit capital that fueled the American underworld. His power reached terrifying new heights in the late 1950s. The United States government, the same entity that had locked him in the Atlanta penitentiary, came asking for a favor. The Central Intelligence Agency was obsessed with the communist revolution in Cuba. Fidel Castro had seized power. He had shut down the lucrative mob-run casinos in Havana. The CIA wanted Castro dead. The mob wanted Castro dead. Their interests aligned perfectly. The CIA approached Robert Mayhew, a private investigator with deep intelligence connections. Mayhew reached out to Johnny Roselli. The federal government, operating at the highest levels of Cold War paranoia, hired a convicted extortionist to assassinate a foreign head of state. Roselli accepted the contract. He introduced the CIA operatives to Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit, and Santo Trafficante, the mob boss of Tampa. Together, they plotted to poison Castro. They plotted to shoot him. They orchestrated complex, highly classified operations involving explosives and sniper rifles. Roselli traveled back and forth to Miami. He met with Cuban exiles. He handled the logistics of state-sponsored murder. He had transitioned from extorting movie studios to executing foreign policy. He was an untouchable asset. The federal government had essentially granted him a license to operate his criminal enterprises without interference, as long as he continued to assist the CIA. He was dining with intelligence directors. He was insulated by the highest levels of national security. June Lang read the newspapers. Decades had passed since her divorce. The sting of the blacklist had dulled into a permanent heavy ache. She lived a quiet, anonymous life. She watched the world change. She saw the man she had briefly called her husband transition into a figure of dark, mythological power. He was no longer just a Hollywood fixer. He was a geopolitical operative. She understood that the system was unfixable. The corruption was not an anomaly. It was the foundation. The movie studios, the police, the federal agencies, the intelligence community, they were all interconnected gears in a machine designed to protect men like Johnny Roselli. The rules of morality, ethics, and justice were fictions sold to the public to keep them compliant. The reality was a brutal Darwinian struggle where the most ruthless men won, and the innocent were ground into dust to pave their roads. June found solace in her obscurity. Her anonymity became her armor. She realized that to be famous in that world was to be a target. To be successful in that industry was to be compromised. She had lost her career, but she had retained her soul. She had refused to be a part of their machine. She had walked away. The poverty and the humiliation were the price of her integrity. Looking at the old movie posters stored in a box in her apartment, she stared at the vibrant, smiling face of June Lang and felt a profound sorrow. That young woman had genuinely believed in the magic of the movies, trusting that hard work and talent would inevitably be rewarded. She had no idea she was dancing on a glamorous stage built by gangsters and financed by cowards. Roselli's untouchable status would not last forever. The arrogance that fueled his rise would eventually dictate his fall. He believed he was smarter than the government. He believed he was smarter than the mob bosses who gave him his orders. He began to talk too much. He began to operate outside of his designated lanes. The machine that had protected him for so long was beginning to view him as a liability. The same pragmatic ruthlessness that the studios had used to discard June Lang was about to be applied to Johnny Roselli by men far more dangerous than film executives. The pendulum of violence was swinging back. The shadows were closing in on the smooth operator. His bespoke suits and his Hollywood connections would offer no protection against the brutal, inevitable arithmetic of the underworld. The bill for a lifetime of deception was coming due. The 1960s arrived with a violent shift in the American political landscape. Johnny Roselli stood at the absolute zenith of his power. He operated out of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. He wore silk ties. He kept company with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack. He was the vital artery connecting the immense, untaxed wealth of the casino, counting rooms to the vaults of the Chicago outfit. He was untouchable. He possessed the ultimate insurance policy. He was a contracted asset of the Central Intelligence Agency. He believed that holding the secrets of the United States government made him bulletproof. It was a fatal miscalculation. Arrogance blinds a man to the shifting shadows in his own house. The election of John F. Kennedy changed the arithmetic of power. Kennedy appointed his brother Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy hated the mafia. He despised the corruption that had infected the labor unions and the entertainment industry. He launched a relentless, highly organized war against organized crime. He formed specialized task forces. He authorized wiretaps. He subpoenaed mob bosses. The era of the comfortable golf course relationships between gangsters and politicians was abruptly terminated. The Justice Department targeted the leadership of the Chicago outfit. They targeted Sam Giancana. They targeted Johnny Roselli. The federal agents began to squeeze. The FBI tailed Roselli everywhere he went in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. They noted his meetings. They photographed his associates. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, discovered the secret alliance between the CIA and the Mafia. Hoover was furious. He weaponized this information. He used it to gain leverage over the Kennedy administration and the intelligence community. Roselli found himself trapped in the crossfire of a massive bureaucratic war within the federal government. The CIA wanted to protect him because he knew about the illegal assassination plots against Fidel Castro. The Justice Department wanted to put him in a cage. Roselli thought he could play the two sides against each other. He was a diplomat. He was the Henry Kissinger of the underworld. He assumed he could negotiate a truce. He assumed his value as an intelligence asset outweighed his crimes. As a mobster, he was wrong. The government is not a rational partner. The government is a machine designed to protect its own survival. When the CIA realized that Roselli was attracting too much heat from the FBI, they quietly severed the connection. They burned his files. They disavowed him. The invisible shield that had protected him evaporated. The pressure from the government disrupted the flow of cash. The casino skimming operations in Las Vegas came under intense scrutiny. Federal agents raided the counting rooms. The Chicago outfit was losing money. When the mob loses money, the mob demands blood. The old guard of the Chicago syndicate was changing. The diplomatic bosses were being replaced by brutal, paranoid men. Tony Accardo, the ultimate power broker of the outfit, was losing patience with the high-profile lifestyle of men like Giancana and Roselli. Accardo believed that mobsters should be invisible. He despised the flashbulbs. He despised the Hollywood producers. He despised the fact that Johnny Roselli was a household name. June Lang watched this geopolitical drama unfold from the safety of her modest living room. She read the evening newspapers. She watched the black and white television broadcasts. She saw the name Johnny Roselli splashed across the front pages. She saw the allegations of casino skimming, political corruption, and international assassination plots. The sheer scale of the monster she had briefly married was finally revealed in its entirety. She felt a profound, chilling validation. She had not just divorced a bad husband. She had narrowly escaped a vortex of historic violence. Settling into a quiet, heavily structured life of typing letters, operating switchboards, and paying taxes, she possessed zero leverage and held no state secrets. Yet, without any mob protection or studio backing, she finally slept soundly at night. She did not have to check the ignition of her car for explosives. She did not have to look over her shoulder when she walked down the street. She had traded the opulent mansions of Beverly Hills for a small, anonymous apartment, and in doing so, she had purchased her peace of mind. The Hollywood machine that had crushed her was now being exposed as morally bankrupt. The studio executives who had blacklisted her were sweating under federal subpoenas. It did not matter to her anymore. She had found a sanctuary outside the illusion. Roselli was losing his sanctuary. The federal government finally caught him on a tax evasion charge. It was a mundane crime for a man who had plotted to poison heads of state, but it was effective. He was convicted. He was facing deportation. The government threatened to strip him of his citizenship and send him back to Italy. He fought the deportation order with every dollar he had left. He hired the best lawyers. He leveraged his remaining political contacts. He managed to delay the deportation, but he was drowning in legal fees. He was losing his grip on the Las Vegas casinos. Younger, more ruthless men were pushing him out of his territory. The ultimate betrayal occurred in the 1970s. The political climate of the United States shifted again. The Watergate scandal shattered the public trust in the government. The Senate formed the Church Committee to investigate abuses by the intelligence agencies. The dark secrets of the Cold War were being dragged into the sunlight. The committee subpoenaed Johnny Roselli. They wanted him to testify about the CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. This was the critical juncture. The fundamental rule of the mafia is omerta, the code of silence. You do not talk to the authorities. You do not testify before Senate committees. You take the prison sentence. You take the bullet. You never break the silence. Roselli broke the rule. He appeared before the church committee. He testified under oath. He detailed the poison pills. He detailed the sniper rifles. He named the CIA operatives. He named his mob associates. He believed he was performing a patriotic duty. He believed that by cooperating with the Senate, he could secure immunity from his deportation order. He thought he was outsmarting the system one final time. He thought his testimony made him too important to kill. He fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of the men he worked for. Tony Accardo and the bosses in Chicago watched the congressional hearings with cold reptilian fury. Johnny Roselli was on national television spilling the secrets of the outfit. He was drawing the attention of every federal prosecutor in the country directly to their doorstep. To the mob, testifying before the Senate is not patriotism. It is treason. A rat is a rat regardless of whether he wears a bespoke suit or a cheap trench coat. Roselli had become an intolerable liability. He was a loose end that was flapping loudly in the wind. The atmosphere around him turned toxic. His associates stopped returning his phone calls. The men who used to buy him drinks at the Brown Derby now crossed the street to avoid him. He was a walking ghost. He could feel the crosshairs settling on the back of his neck. The diplomatic skills that had saved him countless times were now useless. You cannot negotiate with a bullet. Consumed by deep paranoia, Roselli abandoned his regular routines, constantly varying his driving routes and locking himself inside his apartment. He knew the mechanics of a mob hit better than anyone, having arranged them himself in the past. He understood the terrifying reality. The killers would not be strangers. They would be friends and trusted associates who would invite him to dinner, offer him a drink, and smile warmly right up until the moment they pulled the trigger. The pressure became unbearable. Realizing Los Angeles was no longer a safe haven but a hunting ground, Roselli fled to the humid swamps of Miami. He needed a sanctuary and hoped Santo Trafficante, the Florida boss who shared his classified CIA secrets, would offer protection. Miles away, June Lang read a brief mention in the newspaper that her ex-husband had relocated to Florida. She felt a cold shiver. She understood the unspoken language of the underworld. Men like Johnny Roselli do not retire to Florida. They flee. She knew his violent final act was beginning. In Miami, Roselli met with Trafficante to seek assurances, but he failed to realize that in the underworld, past loyalty is a rapidly depreciating asset. Trafficante hadn't survived decades by protecting liabilities. He survived by eliminating them. The Florida boss listened to Roselli's pleas, smiled warmly, offered him a drink, and falsely assured him that he was safe. The Florida sun was brutal in July of 1976. Johnny Roselli left his sister's house in Plantation, Florida. Borrowing her car, he claimed he was going to play a round of golf. He was 71 years old. His lungs were failing and his political leverage was gone. He drove toward the coast, walked down a wooden dock, and met men he considered friends. The Mafia does not execute its senior members in dark alleys with masked gunmen. They use intimacy. They use trust. Roselli accepted an invitation to go boating. He stepped onto a private vessel, and the engines rumbled to life. The boat steered out into the blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the shoreline and the jurisdiction of the United States government behind. The men on board offered him a drink. They smiled and spoke about the old days in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Roselli let his guard down. He believed Trafficante had brokered a peace. He believed the rules of diplomacy still applied to him. He took a sip of his drink. He never finished it. They did not shoot him, knowing full well that a gunshot makes a mess and leaves undeniable forensic evidence on the deck of a boat. Instead, they moved in quietly, either wrapping a garrote around his neck or simply using their bare hands to brutally choke the air out of his failing lungs. Although Roselli fought and thrashed desperately against the men holding him down, he was old, frail, and entirely outnumbered. The smooth diplomat of the underworld suffocated on the sunlit deck of a pleasure cruiser until his heart finally stopped beating. The execution was only the first phase of the operation. The Chicago outfit did not just want Johnny Roselli dead. They wanted him to disappear completely. They wanted to send a message to anyone else considering testifying before a Senate committee. The men dragged his rigid corpse across the deck. They produced a heavy 55-gallon steel oil drum. They stripped Roselli of his dignity. They shoved his body into the rusted metal cylinder. It was a tight fit. They had to compress his limbs. They forced the lid shut. They wrapped heavy steel chains around the exterior of the drum. They fastened the chains tightly to ensure it would drag the container straight to the ocean floor. They punched holes in the steel to allow the water to rush in and the decomposition gases to escape. They pushed the heavy drum over the side of the boat. It hit the water with a heavy splash. It sank into the murky depths of Dumbfoundling Bay. The killers steered the boat back to the marina. They washed the deck. They went home. The Henry Kissinger of the mob, the man who had extorted Hollywood studios, produced major motion pictures, and plotted to assassinate Fidel Castro, was reduced to toxic waste in a metal barrel. The Chicago outfit believed the ocean would keep their secret. They underestimated the physics of a rotting human body. 10 days passed. The heavy chains were not enough to counteract the expanding gases inside the steel drum. The buoyancy increased. On August 9, 1976, a group of fishermen spotted a rusted metal object bobbing in the shallow waters of Biscayne Bay. It smelled foul. They notified the Marine Patrol. Police boats towed the drum to the shore. Detectives pried the lid open. The stench of decay filled the humid air. The body inside was severely decomposed. The face was unrecognizable. The medical examiner pulled the corpse out of the metal casing. The police took fingerprints from the bloated hands. They ran the prints through the federal database. The match triggered alarms in Washington and Chicago. The news broke across national television and print media. The photographs of the rusted oil drum were splashed across the front pages of the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. The United States Senate panicked. The church committee realized they had underestimated the ruthless efficiency of the Mafia. A year earlier, Sam Giancana had been shot in the back of the head in his Chicago basement before he could testify. Now, Roselli was found floating in a barrel. The mafia was cleaning house. They were silencing the men who knew the secrets of the CIA assassination plots. The federal government realized that their former contractors were entirely beyond their control. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles, June Lang walked to the end of her driveway. She picked up the morning paper. She was 59 years old. She lived a frugal, anonymous life. She sat at her small kitchen table. She unfolded the newspaper. She saw the photograph of the oil drum. She saw the name of her ex-husband. She did not cry, nor did she feel a sudden wave of grief, because the man in the barrel was essentially a stranger to her. The man she had married in 1940 had never really existed. He was merely a fabricated persona. As she read the grisly autopsy details about the heavy chains and the brutal asphyxiation, she calmly put the newspaper down and looked around her kitchen. It was small, it was quiet, and most importantly, it was completely safe. The contrast between her reality and his demise was absolute. Roselli had spent his entire life accumulating illicit power. He had manipulated the most powerful executives in the entertainment industry. He had extorted millions. He had operated with absolute arrogance. He believed he was the smartest man in any room. He ended his life suffocating in terror, discarded like industrial garbage in a swamp. June had been stripped of her power. She had been robbed of her career. The studios had blacklisted her. They had forced her into poverty. They had erased her from the silver screen. She had spent decades answering telephones and filing paperwork to survive, but she had survived. She had maintained her integrity. When she discovered the truth about Roselli in 1943, she did not look the other way. She did not accept the blood money. She severed the tie immediately. She took the punishment that the cowardly studio executives dealt her, and she carried it with quiet dignity. Looking at the newspaper, she received the ultimate, brutal validation of her choice. If she had stayed with him, if she had played the role of the loyal mob wife, her life would have been consumed by that same violence. She would have spent her days waiting for the federal agents to knock on the door, or waiting for the phone call telling her that her husband had been found in a bay. By choosing the difficult path, by accepting the destruction of her Hollywood dream, she had saved her own life. The studio executives who had orchestrated her downfall experienced no such revelations. They read the same newspapers. Men like Harry Cohn were already dead, having lived long, wealthy lives. The remaining studio heads felt no remorse for what they had done to June Lang. They did not issue public apologies. They did not offer her a new acting contract. The Hollywood machine simply kept turning. They hired new fixers. They found new ways to manage their labor problems. They continued to enforce their hypocritical morals, clauses against vulnerable actors, while ignoring the corruption in their own boardrooms. The federal government launched an investigation into Roselli's murder. The FBI interviewed Santo Trafficante. They interviewed associates in Chicago. Nobody talked. The code of silence held firm. The murder of Johnny Roselli was never officially solved. Nobody was ever charged. The oil drum was relegated to the evidence locker. The case went cold. The government had used Roselli when he was convenient, and they abandoned his ghost when he was not. June Lang outlived the powerful studio moguls who blacklisted her and the ruthless mobsters who manipulated her. Passing away peacefully in 2005 at the age of 88, she died as she had lived her later years, in quiet, dignified obscurity. Her story remains the ultimate autopsy of Hollywood's golden age, dismantling the manufactured glamour to expose an ecosystem where morality was merely a commodity, and innocence was acceptable collateral damage. While Johnny Roselli's pursuit of absolute power ended in a rusted steel drum, a victim of the very violence he championed, June secured the ultimate victory. By walking away from the factory of dreams, she saved her own life, leaving the monsters to consume themselves in the dark.